Do you have a nice, extremely well modelled propeller factory on your N-scale model railway, but no appropriate rolling stock? Greetings, I'm Herbert Erpaderp, and I too once had this problem. A problem I solved through the magic of 3D printing. These are air screw wagons, an air screw being a propeller, the telegraph code for which was Aero, he says as though he knows what he's talking about. Don't worry, I don't. I stumbled upon these at some point and found them very interesting. Unfortunately, as best I can tell, there is no ready-to-run option for these wagons, at least not in N-scale. There was, and is, however, a 00 scale printable version on Thingiverse, which is also, obviously, not N-scale. At the time, I'd only recently got my resin 3D printer, and I was naturally excited to use it, so I figured, why not have a go at rescaling and printing my own Aero wagons. You can see in the diagram that the design includes a frame, brake levers, and coupling boxes. I figured it might take a lot of kajiggering to get a frame scaled right to fit with the wheels and such, and it would be a lot easier, and probably a bit less wasteful, to simply use one from one of these Pico wagon kits. I believe you can also buy these frames by themselves, but I already had the kits, and I plan on using the van part as grounded vans, so nothing's going to be wasted. Of course, buying frames does make this kind of project cost more, but in this case, I'm not 3D printing to save money, but to have something that otherwise doesn't exist. Also, sometimes spending money means less arsing about, and that does have some value. I didn't really take very good notes of my 3D printing adventures, but I scaled the design down to 51.87%. I came to that by making it the width of the frame rather than whatever the actual percentage to convert from 00 to N scale is. It's a couple of percent difference, so the scale might be wrong now, but it fits the frame, and in my eyes it looked better. I had to do the supports myself, so that took a bit of experimenting, and as you can see, there are some quite thin parts on the A-frame things. That did take a couple of tries to get it right, and not have them being all bendy and wibbly wobbly, but eventually I got a result that worked. Not perfect, and it did warp a little bit, but it was good enough for me. The Pico frame will help straighten things out a bit too. Do keep in mind, this was the first time I'd done this kind of thing. Removing the top part from the supports left a few nubbins on the bottom. This was preferable to having the nubbins on the upper portion of the model, which would almost certainly result in breaking the thin parts while trying to remove the supports. Ask me how I know. The wagon frames also required some work. You can see there are nubbins on top of it, which prevent the 3D printed part from fitting nicely, or at all, really, so those need to be removed. Once I had the top sitting nice and flat, I could see that it was a bit long, which was not unexpected. Having it be a bit too long is better than it being too narrow, which is why I made it that way. It wasn't too hard to just clip a bit off the end. I did this slowly and carefully to avoid shattering the resin. I did a bit more sanding and a lot of test fitting, and eventually, I was happy with the fit. You might notice there's a couple of holes in the wagon top for the Y-shaped crates, so I marked those out and hacked a couple of holes into the frames. Nice and messy. There is probably a better way to do this, with proper tools and such, but this worked as well. The alternative was to cut the bottom of the crates so they'd be flush with the deck, or flush with the frame underneath the deck, I suppose. I could then attach the offcuts to the bottom of the wagon. The way I did it seems to be the easier way, which is why I did it. The good news is, the top of the wagon covers up how messy those holes are. It's almost time to glue the tops to the frame, but first, couplings. You won't be able to attach them later, and if you want a functioning model, they're kind of important. To hold the couplings in place, you need this little tab that's molded onto the bottom of the van body. This is what keeps the coupling at the appropriate angle, so it doesn't just flop downward. The glue probably isn't really necessary, I just like gluing stuff. It did result in at least one of the couplings being fairly rigid, let's say. It still works fine though. I then glue the wagon top to the frame. I'm using super glue because plastic cement won't work with this resin. I wish it would, but it doesn't. Because the resin part does have a slight bend, I did this in steps. I glued one end, making sure it was bonded, and then I glued the other end down. You do have to hold this while the glue sets, because obviously the curve being straightened causes tension, but with super glue it should bond pretty quick. The result is pretty reasonable, I think. It's not perfect, but it is passable, and I'm not trying to please rivet counters here, only myself. At this point I removed the propeller crates from their supports and test fitted them. I would call this a successful test. I did consider gluing the crates into place, but I figured any benefit would be outweighed by how annoying it might be to paint when it's all together, plus the increased risk of damaging thin parts. And now it's time to paint. Priming comes before painting, and because I'm just so good at holding onto things, after priming, I immediately dropped one of the wagons, with unsurprisingly disappointing results. I endured the annoyance of printing and preparing a new top, and on the second try, I didn't drop it, so that's nice. I airbrushed the base coat with Railmatch Great Western Stock Grey. Being Great Western wagons, I feel like this made a lot of sense. I base coat the propeller boxes with Vallejo model colour German Camouflage Medium Brown. I've no idea what colour these boxes would be, so I'm just going with brown. Simple enough. You might notice that I've drilled a hole and glued some brass rod into the bottom of the boxes to act as a kind of handle for painting. Time for decals. I had a couple of sheets of Great Western decals from Fox Transfers, which included these teeny tiny GW markings. It was very fiddly getting these decals into the little space inside the frame there, as you might imagine. I did also have some very small numbers, but I simply couldn't get them into the ends of the frame, so I gave up on those. I almost didn't bother with the GW markings either, and I did ruin a couple, but I'm glad I persisted. It really does improve the look of the wagons. Now, to make the wagons look a bit dirty, I apply an all-over wash using Army Painter Strong Tone, which has been thinned roughly 1 part Strong Tone and 2 parts water, and this will get slopped all over the model. It will darken everything down a bit and give a subtle hint of dirt. It does tend to pool up in any gaps and corners, which is the idea, though it's best to not let it pool up too much, because if there's too much of it, it creates tide marks when it dries, which generally don't look very good. I also apply this to the propeller crates. These would probably be a bit cleaner than the wagon itself, but I still want them to have that colour variation and a bit of dirt. Once the wash is dry, I go over it with a dry brushing of the base coat, that being Railmatch GWR Stock Grey. This is not the best paint for dry brushing, it's a little bit too wet, so it hasn't made a huge difference here, but it has done something. Even very subtle layers contribute something. I did another lighter dry brushing using Vallejo model colour Neutral Grey. You can see right away that this is a much more obvious effect. The brush I'm using is a domed contour brush intended for makeup. The reason I use these is they're very soft, and that makes for a nice smooth dry brush. It also means it's really gentle with delicate thin pieces of resin, which is really good for something like this. I probably should have done this earlier, but now I'm painting the end of the brake lever with model colour off-white. This is obviously a very small thing to paint, but it's not too hard if you're careful and use an appropriate brush. I follow this by painting the buffers black. I didn't make a note of what black I used, but it was probably the SMS black primer that I used. It is a good black as well as a good primer. I did also paint the couplings on one of the wagons black, but for some reason, only one. I also thought about painting the running gear black. It probably should be black, but I liked the grey and figured it might show the weathering a bit better, so I left it. Next, figuring the A-frames are probably metal, I used some Vallejo Model Air Light Rust in a couple of places on the metal parts. I was trying not to go too heavy with this. I want these to be in-service wagons, not rusted out pieces of scrap. As I went, I used a crappy older brush. You can see by looking at it that it's pretty crap. I used it to sort of remove and smudge the rust and blend it in a bit. Then I figured that brake handle, having missed the first wash, was kind of sticking out like a sore thumb. So, like a sore thumb, I put some strong tone on it so it looks a bit worn and dirty. Continuing the worn and dirty theme, I apply some Model Air Rust. That is rust, not light rust again. There is a bit of a difference. I thinned this roughly 3 parts water to 1 part rust, and I'm mostly applying this around the leaf springs and braking gear. I think I went a little bit too heavy with it in some places, but it seems to work quite well, and it's now a little bit harder to tell those parts were grey. I also thought, why not paint the wheels, at least the outside of them? I used Model Air Rust for this too, though this was straight out of the bottle. These aren't especially visible, so if I were to repeat this project, I wouldn't paint the wheels again. Also, these are just the plastic wheels that came with the kit. I'm probably going to replace these with metal wheels at some point, so it doesn't really matter too much. Next, I applied some Ammo Shader Matte Grime, which was very slightly diluted, maybe 2 parts grime to 1 part water. I mostly put this around the axle boxes and the pivot point of the brake lever, just to represent some grease and grime. It kind of does what it says on the bottle. I then spent a while umming and ahhing about whether or not to add more weathering, and I chose not to, at least for now. I haven't forgotten about the propeller crates. These didn't need too much work at all. I dry brushed them with the base coat, which was model colour German camouflage medium brown, and I do this, obviously, to bring that base colour back a little bit after the dark wash. I follow that with a slightly lighter dry brushing with model colour beige brown. This was alright, but I still wasn't totally happy with it. It's still a little bit dark. So I did one more dry brushing, this time with model colour cork brown, which was focused almost entirely around the edges. I think the result is pretty good. It's very simple, but effective. And that's it. After applying a coat of ultra matte varnish, I put the crates in position on the wagons, and now I've got some, in my opinion, pretty nice looking N-scale Aero wagons, or air screw wagons, or propeller wagons, or whatever you might like to call them. Just like with tanks, I quite enjoy the stranger, more weird looking things, and this certainly fits the bill. It is a kind of odd looking piece of rolling stock, and that's very appealing to me. It is also relevant to my interest in World War II, so I had to have one. 2. I felt 2 was probably reasonable, but hey, if any manufacturers are thinking about making one of these ready to run, I would quite happily add 2 or 3 or 5 more to my collection. I'm sure that will tip the scales. Anyway, this was a fun project. I mean, as a beginner figuring out 3D printing, it was very moderately frustrating, and I was quite upset with myself when I dropped one, but I feel like I learned a lot, and overall it was a good experience, and I think the result is quite good. I would like to encourage others to do the same, assuming you have a 3D printer, and wagons or anything, that you can't otherwise get in the scale you model. Using the ready-to-run frames made the entire thing less, well, stressful is probably not really the right word, but it did let me feel a lot more confident that in the end, I would have wagons that would run without issue. And run without issue, they do. So here's a little scene I shot where this lovely pannier tank is picking up some propellers from the highly detailed factory that I spent many hours painstakingly building, and hauling them off to some distant destination. Probably an aircraft factory. After all, what's the point of having such wagons if you're not going to play with them? Let's just pretend this V2 going past twice are actually 2 different trains. You didn't catch the number, did you? Maybe this would look a bit more appealing if I actually had some scenery. You mean blue foam and plywood isn't scenery? Ah, well, sure, why not? This is a slow hobby, I suppose, and it is still fun to play trains with no scenery. Just use your imagination, like with the V2. I mean, V2s. You can see what I mean about the couplings not moving. N-scale stuff is so light that even when the couplings can move, this sort of thing still happens. It's probably not something to get too upset about. There was a weight included with the van kits, though clearly there's no room for that on this model, and I haven't really seen a need for it anyway. Anyway, off we go. Headed for, North Kilt Town. I don't know. I do know, however, that those Rapido gunpowder vans are really nice. Maybe there's an ammunition factory near the plain one. It's fun to imagine. This entire project was pretty fun. Not only that, but I have probably learned. I feel more confident in my 3D printing abilities, and in the time between printing these and the eventual making of this video, I've made a bunch of other stuff too. Some you've already seen. One of the benefits, or at least a benefit that I will personally have, from having to do the test prints for this, is that some of the failures will be useful for modelling a scrapyard, which I do plan on building, so now I'm hoarding random bits and pieces to paint up all rusty, but that's a project for distant future Herbert to worry about. Ooh, look, there's actually a tiny bit of scenery. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. It's pretty good for that sort of thing. Subscribe here if you want to see more of this kind of thing, and if you really like what I do and you want to see videos a bit early, consider supporting on Patreon. I sure would appreciate it. Links are in the description. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, happy modelling, and thanks for watching. Farewell.